My name is Zuri, and at 34 years old, I am the woman powerful men call when their world is burning down. In the high-stakes arena of Washington, D.C., I spend my days silencing scandals for senators and rewriting the narratives of CEOs who have stumbled from grace. I am a master of crisis management, a professional who knows exactly when to whisper and when to roar to get what I want. However, there is a profound irony in my life that no amount of professional success can mask. While I can command a room full of the nation's most influential leaders with a single glance, I have spent the last 5 years feeling completely powerless in the presence of my mother-in-law, Claudette. The air inside LeBlanc was thick with the scent of expensive truffle oil and the quiet clinking of silver against fine china. It was the kind of restaurant where the elite come to be seen and where the menus purposefully omit prices because if you have to ask, you simply do not belong. I had secured this reservation weeks in advance using my corporate connections, yet as I sat at the head of the table, I felt like an unwelcome guest in my own life. Claudette sat across from me, her eyes scanning my tailored charcoal suit with a coldness that could freeze the Potomac in mid-July. Beside her, my sister-in-law Kiyana was busy adjusting her silk scarf, her expression mirroring her mother's practiced arrogance. Claudette leaned forward, her voice a sharp contrast to the soft jazz playing in the background. She told me that it was a shame I could not find the time to change into something more feminine and refined for such a prestigious establishment. She described my professional attire as stiff and lacking the effortless grace that their family bloodline required. Kiyana chimed in with a sharp giggle, adding that perhaps my background in Detroit made it difficult for me to understand the nuances of high society aesthetics. She whispered that looking like a tired government clerk was hardly the image they wanted to project at the upcoming family events. I felt the heat rising in my chest, but I did not let my mask slip. Claudette continued her assault by reminding everyone at the table that I came from a family of blue-collar laborers. She spoke about our working-class roots as if it were a contagious disease, contrasting my humble beginnings with the aristocratic legacy she claimed they possessed. I took a slow sip of my wine, letting the silence stretch until the tension was nearly unbearable. Then I leaned in and spoke with a calm that cut through their pretension like a blade. I reminded Claudette that while she cherished her imaginary aristocratic status, it was a check from that very same laboring family that had prevented the bank from foreclosing on her house only last year. I watched the color drain from her face as I told her that my hard-earned money was apparently the only thing about me that was elegant enough for her taste. The silence from Deandre was more deafening than any insult his mother could have hurled. I turned my gaze toward my husband, the man whose medical school tuition I had funded, and whose dreams I had carried on my back for 7 long years. I waited for him to stand up for the woman who shared his bed and his last name. Instead, he kept his eyes fixed on his plate, carefully cutting his steak, as if the porcelain was more precious than my dignity. When he finally looked up, there was no fire in his eyes, only a cold and calculated apathy that felt like a physical blow to my chest. He cleared his throat and told me that his mother had a valid point about my heavy workload. He said that since I was so deeply buried in my career at the firm, it would be best if I simply sat this one out. Deandre calmly explained that the wedding in Aspen would be far too stressful for someone with my demanding schedule. He suggested that I should stay behind to rest while the rest of the family enjoyed the festivities. His voice was smooth and persuasive, but I could hear the underlying message as clearly as a bell. I was not being excused because of my career. I was being hidden because I did not fit the curated, polished image they wanted to project to their high society friends. To them, my dark skin and my unapologetic presence were flaws that would ruin the wedding photographs. The true moment of clarity came when I accidentally dropped my silk napkin. As I reached down to retrieve it, I saw a sight that shattered whatever remained of my heart. Underneath the white linen tablecloth, Deandre was firmly grasping Claudette's hand. It was a secret, rhythmic squeeze of solidarity, a silent pact between mother and son that excluded me entirely. In that dark space beneath the table, the truth was laid bare. My husband was not caught in the middle. He had chosen his side long ago. I was not his partner or his equal. To this family, I was nothing more than a walking, breathing black credit card with an unlimited balance. They did not want me, but they desperately wanted the life my money provided. As I sat back up, I realized that I was looking at a table full of strangers who were fattening themselves on my sacrifices. The man I loved was merely a beautiful parasite, and the knife he just twisted in my back would be the last one I ever allowed him to hold. The house was suffocatingly quiet when we returned from that disastrous dinner, a silence that felt heavy with the weight of unsaid truths. Deandre had retreated to his study with a dismissive wave, acting as if he had not just handed his mother the ammunition to humiliate me. I sat on the edge of our king-sized bed, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. There was a nagging instinct, a cold shiver crawling down my spine that told me the betrayal ran deeper than just cruel words at a restaurant. I opened my laptop, the blue light reflecting in my eyes as I logged into our joint high-yield savings account. This was the sacred fund, the culmination of 3 years of grueling overtime and sacrificed vacations. We had meticulously set aside $50,000 for our final attempt at in vitro fertilization. At 34 years old, with my biological clock ticking like a time bomb, that money represented my last flickering hope of holding a child of my own. It was supposed to be the foundation of the family I had dreamed of since I was a little girl in Detroit, a dream of a home filled with laughter and the legacy of a love that was supposed to be unbreakable. My breath hitched when the balance appeared on the screen. The number was not $50,000, it was zero. My vision blurred as I scrolled through the transaction history, my hands shaking so violently that I could barely click the mouse. There it was, a series of massive transfers made over the last 48 hours. Deandre had authorized a $30,000 payment to a luxury bridal boutique for a custom Vera Wang gown. Another $20,000 had been wired as a non-refundable deposit for a premium open bar and a gourmet seafood tower at the Aspen Resort. He had not just taken my money. He had reached into my womb and stolen my future to pay for his sister's vanity. He had sacrificed our unborn child so that Kiyana could play princess for a single weekend. The pain that washed over me was visceral, a raw and jagged agony that made it hard to draw air into my lungs. As a black woman, I had been taught to be the pillar of strength, to endure, and to provide, but this was a desecration of my soul. I realized then that while I was planning for a life together, Deandre was merely harvesting my resources to subsidize his family's delusions of grandeur. He knew how much that money meant to me. He had held me while I cried after the previous failed cycles, whispering promises of a better tomorrow, while he was already plotting how to spend the funds on his sister's wedding. The betrayal was so calculated and so cruel that it burned away the last remnants of my affection. The warmth I once felt for him was replaced by a cold, hard diamond of resolve. I closed the laptop slowly, the clicking sound echoing like a gavel in a courtroom. There would be no more tears, and there would be no more mercy. If they wanted a high-stakes drama, I would give them a masterclass in total destruction. They thought they had left me with nothing, but they forgot that I am a woman who thrives in a crisis. The next morning, I wore my professional mask like a suit of armor. I told Deandre that an urgent crisis had erupted with a high-profile client in Washington, D.C., and that I would need to leave immediately for an indefinite period. He barely looked up from his breakfast, his eyes sparkling with a thinly veiled relief. To him, my departure was a convenient disappearance that saved him the trouble of uninviting me to Aspen. I packed my bags with a precision that felt like loading a weapon. As I drove toward the Capitol, I did not feel like a grieving wife. I felt like a general preparing for a scorched earth campaign. By the time I reached my office on K Street, my strategic mind was already operating at full capacity. I spent the first 4 hours of the afternoon managing a delicate infidelity scandal for a junior senator, weaving a narrative that would protect his career while quietly burying the truth. My colleagues saw a dedicated professional at work, but my true focus was on the second computer screen hidden behind my mahogany desk. With a few deliberate keystrokes, I accessed my primary wealth management portal. I contacted my private banker and initiated a total overhaul of my security protocols. I established a biometric lock on every single supplementary card linked to my accounts. From that moment forward, any transaction exceeding $5,000 would require a live facial scan and a thumbprint verification from my encrypted device. I was effectively turning Deandre's black card into a useless piece of plastic at the exact moment he would need it most. However, a defensive strategy was not enough for the level of disrespect I had endured. I needed intelligence. I reached out to a private investigator I had used for years in my crisis work, a man who could find a needle in a haystack and then tell you who put it there. I tasked him with digging into the background of Jalen, the man Kiyana was so desperate to marry. The report arrived in my inbox just as the sun began to set over the Washington Monument. The findings were nothing short of explosive. Jalen and his parents were not the wealthy real estate moguls they claimed to be. In reality, they were sophisticated operators of a crumbling multi-level marketing scheme that was currently under federal investigation for racketeering. They were drowning in over $2 million of debt and were facing multiple lawsuits from angry investors. The irony was delicious. Jalen's family was targeting Deandre and his mother because they believed the lies my husband had told about his own family's wealth. They were two groups of scavengers trying to pick the bones of a carcass that did not exist. They were all chasing the ghost of my fortune, assuming that the well would never run dry. I leaned back in my chair, watching the city lights flicker to life. I realized that by staying away from Aspen, I wasn't just avoiding a wedding where I wasn't wanted. I was positioning myself in the shadows to watch the entire house of cards collapse under the weight of its own greed. From the quiet sanctuary of my office in Washington, I watched through the glowing portal of social media as my life's work was being devoured by gluttons. Kiyana's Instagram feed had become a digital monument to her own vanity, and every post felt like a deliberate slap across my face. I watched video clips of them clinking crystal flutes of champagne that cost $400 a bottle on the sun-drenched balcony of an Aspen penthouse. I saw my husband Deandre smiling broadly in a custom tuxedo, looking like a man who did not have a single care in the world, let alone a wife whose heart he had recently incinerated. They were indulging in 5-course tasting menus, private ski instructors, and heated outdoor pools, all of it funded by the sweat and tears I had poured into my career. They were living like royalty on a mountain of stolen dreams, oblivious to the fact that the foundation beneath them was made of melting ice. The audacity reached its peak on the morning of the wedding rehearsal. My phone buzzed on the mahogany desk, vibrating with a message that radiated pure malice. It was a high-resolution photograph from Kiyana. She was standing in front of a floor-to-ceiling mirror, draped in the intricate lace and silk of a Vera Wang gown that had cost $30,000 of my IVF savings. Her caption was a masterpiece of cruelty. She wrote that she wanted to thank her dear sister-in-law for the generous donation to her special day. She added with a digital smirk that while I might not have the face or the figure for high fashion, at least my bank account was finally useful for something beautiful. She ended the message by telling me not to work too hard in boring old D.C. while they were making memories that would last a lifetime. I did not scream. I did not cry. I simply took a slow, deliberate sip of a 20-year-old Cabernet, letting the rich notes of dark fruit settle on my tongue. A cold, predatory smile spread across my lips as I realized they had mistaken my silence for submission. They truly believed I was a bottomless well that would continue to provide while they spat into the water. With the steady hand of a surgeon, I picked up my secondary encrypted phone and dialed the direct line to my private wealth manager. I instructed him to immediately deactivate every authorized user on my accounts. I told him to cancel the secondary black cards held by Deandre and Kiyana, effective immediately. Furthermore, I issued a formal directive to the fraud department of the bank. I informed them that I was no longer in Aspen and that any attempt to charge a sum exceeding $500 should be flagged as a high-risk, unauthorized transaction. I specifically requested that they notify the local authorities if any individual attempted to force a large payment through after the initial rejection. I wanted the police involved. I wanted the humiliation to be documented by a badge and a uniform. As I hung up the phone, I felt a profound sense of peace. The faucet of my generosity had been turned off, with a final echoing metallic thud. The vultures were about to find out that when you insult the hand that feeds you, you should be prepared to starve in the cold. The grand ballroom of the Aspen Luxury Resort was a sea of white orchids and shimmering crystal, a decadent display of wealth that I had unknowingly financed. As the clock struck midnight, signaling the end of the reception, the moment of reckoning finally arrived. A tall man in a sharp tuxedo, the lead event coordinator, approached Deandre with a leather-bound folder containing the final bill. The total amount was $200,000, covering everything from the premium open bar to the imported flowers that Kiyana had insisted upon. Deandre did not even blink at the staggering number. He reached into his wallet with the smug confidence of a man who believed his golden goose would never stop laying eggs. He pulled out the titanium black card and handed it over with a flourish, flashing a smile at the guests who were still lingering nearby. The air in the room seemed to shift when the coordinator returned only moments later, his expression no longer deferential, but deeply concerned. He informed Deandre in a low voice that the transaction had been declined. Deandre laughed it off, claiming there must be a technical error with the resort's machine. He told the man to run the card again, but the result remained the same. A bright red light flashed on the payment terminal, and a message appeared on the screen that froze the blood in Deandre's veins. It stated that the account required immediate biometric authentication from the primary cardholder. The coordinator explained that due to new high-level security protocols, a live facial scan and a thumbprint from Zuri were mandatory to authorize any amount over $5,000. The panic began to set in as the reality of the situation dawned on my husband. He stepped away from the crowd, his face pale and sweating, and dialed my number with trembling fingers. Back in Washington, D.C., I was sitting in a glass-walled conference room surrounded by my senior legal team and several colleagues. When my phone began to vibrate, I did not hesitate. I swiped the screen and placed the call on speakerphone, allowing the entire room to witness the sound of a man drowning in his own greed. Deandre's voice was frantic, a desperate whisper, as he begged me to log into the banking app and approve the payment immediately. He told me that the hotel security was beginning to gather near the exit and that his mother and sister were on the verge of a public breakdown. He promised he would explain everything later if I just saved them from this embarrassment right now. I waited for him to finish his pathetic plea, my face a mask of calm indifference. I leaned toward the phone and spoke with a clarity that silenced the room. I told him that I found it fascinating how he only remembered my existence when he needed my signature on a check. I informed him that the $50,000 he stole for the deposit had already been reported to the authorities as unauthorized fraud. As for the $200,000 he currently owed the resort, I told him that those funds were no longer available because I had just used them to retain the most aggressive divorce attorney in the District of Columbia. I finished by saying that since he and his family loved Aspen so much, they should have no problem finding a way to pay for their stay, perhaps by selling the designer clothes they were currently wearing. I wished him a very happy wedding night and disconnected the call before he could utter another word. The luxury of the Aspen Resort was quickly replaced by the sterile, flickering fluorescent lights of the local police station. The transition from high society elegance to criminal processing was swift and brutal. Because the resort management had flagged the incident as a coordinated financial fraud involving a sum of $200,000, the entire wedding party was escorted from the ballroom in a procession of shame. In the cramped waiting area of the precinct, the carefully polished veneer of the two families finally shattered. Jalen and his parents, who only hours ago were boasting about their international real estate empire, began to scream at Deandre and Claudette. They accused my husband of being a penniless fraud who had lured them into a marriage under false pretenses of wealth. The air was thick with venomous insults as the two groups of predators realized they had both been hunting an empty cage. Claudette, with her expensive silk dress now wrinkled and stained with sweat, shrieked that her family was the victim of Jalen's low-class opportunism. However, the most chilling moment occurred when the reality of the situation finally reached Jalen. When a police officer confirmed that all the accounts linked to the wedding had been frozen by the primary owner, Zuri, Jalen did not hesitate. He reached into his tuxedo pocket, pulled out the marriage license they had signed just hours before, and ripped it into tiny pieces with a look of pure disgust. He spat out the words that he did not marry Kiyana for her personality or her looks. He told her to her face that without my money, she was absolutely worthless to him. Kiyana collapsed into a chair, her wails echoing against the cold brick walls as she realized her fairy tale was actually a funeral for her reputation. As for Deandre, the night took a much darker turn. While he was being questioned about the declined card, the authorities uncovered the paper trail I had meticulously provided to the fraud department. A detective entered the room and informed Deandre that he was being placed under arrest for grand larceny and identity theft. I had submitted the digital evidence showing that he had forged my electronic signature to authorize the $50,000 transfer from our protected medical savings account. The realization that he was facing years in prison for stealing the money meant for our unborn child finally broke him. He sat in the interrogation chair, his head in his hands, as the handcuffs clicked shut around his wrists. There were no more secret handshakes with his mother, and no more arrogant smiles. He was just a thief, caught in a trap of his own making, while the woman he had underestimated sat 1,000 miles away, finally breathing the clean air of freedom. The aftermath of the storm brought a clarity that I had not known in years. Within 30 days of the Aspen disaster, my legal team had dismantled the life Deandre and his mother had built on the foundation of my labor. Because the house in the suburbs had been purchased entirely with my premarital earnings and maintained by my salary, the court awarded me full possession. I stood on the front porch with a sense of quiet triumph as a locksmith changed every cylinder in the house. Claudette arrived shortly after her Cadillac, having been repossessed just 2 days prior. She looked diminished, her regal posture replaced by a desperate slouch. She pleaded with me to let her stay in the guest wing, claiming that a woman of her age should not be forced into a studio apartment in a less desirable part of town. I did not raise my voice. I simply handed her 2 plastic bags containing her designer shoes and told her that since she valued family bloodlines so much, she should seek shelter with her daughter Kiyana. I watched from the window as she hailed a cheap rideshare, finally realizing that her reign of unearned luxury had come to an end. Months later, I found myself in a part of the city I rarely visited, overseeing a corporate social responsibility project for a new client. As I walked toward the entrance of a massive shipping warehouse, I saw a man in a stained reflective vest hauling heavy crates onto a loading dock. It was Deandre. Gone were the tailored suits and the arrogance of a medical professional. His medical license had been suspended pending the outcome of his criminal trial, and he was working as a day laborer to pay for his mounting legal fees. He looked up, and our eyes met for a fleeting second. I saw a mountain of regret in his gaze, a silent plea for a forgiveness that would never come. He took a step toward me, perhaps hoping for a conversation or a moment of pity. I did not stop. I did not even break my stride. I looked through him as if he were a pane of glass, a ghost from a life I had already outgrown. As I drove back toward the gleaming lights of Washington, D.C., I realized that my greatest asset was never the millions in my bank account. It was the fierce, unshakable independence that allowed me to walk away when the table no longer served respect. For every black woman who has ever been told she is too much or not enough, let this be your truth. Your self-worth is the only jewelry that never tarnishes. I am Zuri, and I have finally learned that the most beautiful view in the world is the one you see when you finally stop looking back at people who never deserved to see you move forward.